Hi, Cindy.
Sarah, welcome to our presentation for the Educator Collaborative Spring Gathering. Why do we cry? Exploring our educator grief to engage in joy and hope. I'm Dr. Cindy Gerwin.
And I'm Dr. Sarah Norsworthy. And we are here to have a conversation about grief and joy and our sort of current landscape in education and how we are and how we might consider collectively addressing it. So we know that grief is in our school ecosystems and that joy is too. And so we want to think this morning about how we are teaching both with and into joy to feed us forward.
And I think the first thing I started thinking about when we were putting this presentation together was just the sheer volume of headlines that have been out in the world, especially these past few years since COVID, and all of the different um, what I think of assaults on education and educators and how that's impacting both education and educators and what's happening in our schools today.
Right. And what are the messages that we get as we look through those slides? Um, and we know that we're hardwired to focus on what's dangerous. It's a innate part of our humanity and it's helped us survive. But there is a cost when we focus on danger and grief that we need to be mindful of, right?
Yeah, yeah. And again, the headline. So um I think the first thing is starting to consider that there's a small number of people that are actually responsible for a large percentage of not just book bans, but of this concept that education is deficit and there's learning loss and all of these things that are kind of um, just harming educators and by default harming students as well.
And so when we see these messages, right, we know that there's a small number of people, our brain is still thinking about the overwhelming messages of these headlines that schools are failing students, that teachers are not doing and meeting our responsibilities. And we know that there are other stories, but what are the messages, right, that we're getting about how we're supposed to be responding?
And I think about as we start to reflect on this, I started to think about what you talked about just a little bit earlier, Sarah, like our brains are hardwired, right, to protect us from education. So if you think of sort of that reptilian part of our brain, it's constantly on the lookout for what is coming at us, and we're like, you know, immediately responding to that by thinking about like what's causing us safety and what might cause us harm. And I think, when you look at sort of grief and the brain, which I think is our next slide.
So, yeah,
There
so
we
right
go.
here.
Grief in the brain. Okay. That grief is a feeling and grieving is a process. I thought that really kind of took me back and made me think for a moment. But when we think about grief and our brain, um, we're in a relationship, a professional relationship, as it may be, in our schools with our communities, with our administrators, with our kids, with their families. And all of that connection, all of those relationships help us form our professional identity. And grieving, and I thought this was really interesting when I read this, like grieving is a process of our brain to learn or perhaps relearn and reform a new identity based on sort of this new reality that we're a part of because of this sort of constant assault on education. It's an intense emotion that's tied, and gosh, I feel this every day when I was reading through this article, of just, not being able to remember things or not feeling like the empathy that I normally would feel for people. Or I think I mentioned to you when we were putting this together, like I've just found myself feeling almost angry for like the past 2 or 3 weeks, and that's so not like me because I usually am pretty good at being able to push some of that aside and finding some joy in my day. And lately it just feels like really, really hard to push through that sort of anger part of the grief. And how is that affecting me both physically, emotionally? How is that affecting my kids? And that's what I worry most about.
Well, and like, as you're talking, right, about this feeling, right? About and I think these were some of your words as having this conversation, right? That this is an exhausting physically and emotionally, right? An exhausting time. And that even that burnout, right, that we think about, um, is is maybe actually grief. And as you were talking about sort of that process, we have this conception of grief that it's these stages, right? And what I hear you, right, describing is much more what we're seeing on the right? Which is my experience as well. That, it's not grief is not a linear, right, process. It goes back and forth and back and forth and around and tangles up. And people will talk about things like, when things return to normal. And that's not a thing, right? Things are always changing. It's like the one constant, the one thing we can depend on, right, is change.
Right? It's
So,
change.
right. And so this idea that we might have a predictable response that we move through, even if the contexts of our world, right, our family contexts, right, our community and school contexts, our global contexts, if these pieces weren't always shifting, we still wouldn't be experiencing, right, a linear process.
Right, right.
And so we have this feeling, right, of you mentioned anger, and we have sometimes we cry, right, because it helps.
Yeah, yeah. It really truly does to just sit and kind of take a moment and just like release all of that that's like getting bound up inside of you.
Mhm.
Um it does. It really helps. Um just as a release and just a moment of rest and thought and all of those things that help when you just sit and have a good cry.
And I know that we're going to talk about this a little bit later, the book in particular, and I'm thinking here about Fran Pintadera's Why Do We Cry? That, when we talked about this presentation, this was a book that was read to us, right? That we had read to us 2 years ago, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, 2 or 3 years ago, when we both first started with the Educator Collaborative, its founder, Chris Lehman, read the book to us, and I remember, like, when he was reading, just sitting there and crying as he was reading, and then it's interesting because I thought about all of my colleagues because it was right after COVID, like that first fall when we were going back to school, and I thought about all of my colleagues that I just saw day after day crying, just crying in the hallway, in their classrooms, and I, like, bought a copy for all of my colleagues. Like literally, I bought this huge stack of books and I wrote individual notes to all of them and handed them out and just hope that they found um, some relief in the book, in the story, in my note that would help sustain them as they were working through this process of grieving.
Right. And I remember a time at a particularly tense moment where I was at a school board meeting and things had gotten intense. And I went into the hallway after speaking, and I did that thing where that almost like keening cry came out of my mouth, my body, and I kind of doubled over, and I thought I was alone in the hallway, and I heard my husband following me, but I turned and there were two, maybe it was three, fifth or sixth grade age students. And I immediately said, oh, I'm okay, right? Physically, right? I'm okay. Look at my body. I'm fine. I'm having a big feeling. And when we have like big feelings, sometimes tears come out, but you need to understand that like that's okay. And I immediately went, Cindy, into like teacher book talk mode. And I was like, actually, there's this book that you can get. You should totally go to the library tomorrow and check out this book because you're going to find that not only does that crying help you like feel and release a tension, but there are chemicals in tears that actually make us feel better. And so they I think were a little bit stunned at the whole experience. I am still a little bit stunned by the whole experience, but right, this is the world of education sometimes. And but that piece of even when we're in that sort of almost bottomless and overwhelming grief, that process is can still be a healing process even when we're in the midst of it.
Yeah, and I love how you talked about the books. I have the book here out too, and the back matter in the book is, I think, almost as good to me as the story is. Like, and it talks about how you mentioned like tears actually provoke, how does she word it? Like painkillers. Um, um, where does it say? Oh, every time we cry, our bodies produce and release tons of hormones and other substances that act like natural painkillers. They're the reason that we feel better after crying. I thought that was so beautiful. And she talks about the different kinds of tears and why we cry and has a few like beautiful activities. Yes, thank you for holding it up. So I have just found so much comfort and so much joy, like that combination, like it, the comfort in reading that and reading the back matter and feeling like it was okay to cry and go through this grieving process, while at the same time I love how she ends the story talking about how, but there are also happy tears and tears of joy. Like we cry for so many reasons, and I still can't believe that you had the presence of mind to go into teacher book talk mode about, like, I'm really impressed by that. I'm not sure that I would have pulled that off. But yeah, yeah. And I wonder, like the other book that we talked about too, if you could go back a bunch of slides,
Mhm.
you had mentioned this book to me, and like why do we need those tears? Like, what does grief do to us? If you want to read, do you have the book handy, or I can grab my copy, the few pages from this book as well that I think, like that elephant in the room, but what it does, I thought this was so beautifully worded too.
Right, so this is Tamara Ellis Smith and Nancy Whiteside's Grief is an Elephant. And in this book, right, it begins with sometimes grief is an elephant. You might hear her heavy pancake circle feet, or
Oh,
she might take you by surprise. And then it's hard to breathe under all that,
yes.
right? And then in the story, the main character, it says, close your eyes. Nope, she's still there. Howl into her giant ears. She doesn't care. Push her with your hands, shoulder, forehead. Lean into her with your whole body. Now, quick, slip out from under her and run. She's fast, but
And
you're faster.
don't you just like, I just looked at those first few pages and I just felt like they were so indicative of what's happening right now. Like this elephant, these headlines, this assault is like on our chest and making it so difficult to breathe, and we're trying to push back, right? We're leaning into her ear and she's not listening. And so you have what's happening now is teachers that are literally like running away from this job that should be such a noble and honorable. I mean, there is nothing more important in this world than educating our young people, and yet we have so many educators that are running away. And that's what brought us, I think, to this moment. Like, what can we do to help us maybe stop and turn back? um,
Mhm.
and hopefully maybe start to make some changes.
So as you were saying, right, this idea of running away, right, or leaving the profession, for teachers, and it's a tricky balance because one of the things as both a classroom educator and as a coach, as somebody who works with students, with adult students, and with teachers, is that if teaching isn't where you are able to find joy and fulfillment, if you don't love children, like, please walk away, right? Like, that's okay.
Right.
It's okay to
Right.
walk, it's okay. Um, if you are feeling like this place that you really want to be, has shifted and there's a message that's being given that doesn't fit, then, like, what can we do about it, right? And I think that's where you were going, and I was thinking
Yeah.
about this serenity prayer that we know from, AA and is sort of in common culture. Um, and then like the different words for how it was written originally versus how we know it, right?
Yeah, I did not know about this original till you shared it with me. I thought this was a really interesting. It's a subtle shift, but I think it's a really important shift.
That sort of these two texts together, that one is that message of accepting things, and one
Mhm.
is that courage, right? And that there are some things that can't be changed, but the courage is right is to change the things that should be changed, not
Mhm.
necessarily the things that can be changed, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and definitely like cuz we were talking about that subtle little different, the things that should be changed. And I know with my whole heart that I personally cannot change what's happening in education. But it should be changed. It needs to be changed and disrupted because we're causing harm. I firmly believe we're causing harm in so many places to our teachers and our kids. And while I can't do that alone, I think collectively, that's one thing. One thing that we didn't put, like headlines that we didn't put up, is when I think of like the recent strikes with the auto workers union and the writers and actors, like what I think that has started to hopefully teach us is that collectively, we do have power to come together and to start to hopefully call for action and call for some change. Because I alone, you alone, none of us alone um, can affect this change, and that requires so much bravery. Like so many of us, as difficult as it is, we also need our jobs, right? Like I totally get that. um and they need to find people need to find some peace in their job. So that's a question that I constantly like ask myself: how can I help bring a collective? And is that through my union? Is that through some other advocacy group? Like, where can teachers start to bring their voices to the forefront? Because I think the voices we're hearing are not from teachers in the classroom, and that's what is becoming so misleading. Like, where can teachers start to have a voice that will affect change?
Right. And we know that grief and joy go hand in hand. Right. There's that thought that, you recognize joy because of grief, right? And you
Mhm.
recognize grief because of joy. And both stories can be true at the same time, right? And
Yes.
so we can get mired in that. Um, or we can acknowledge it and hold it in one hand, and think about what else is in there, for those of us that love children to stay in it, right?
Right. Right.
um
Right.
do you want to say anything on this slide before I move to the next slide, Cindy?
So as I was like kind of doing a little bit of reading and research about grief, I also came across this article that talked about um you know, again, reinforcing the idea that grief is learning, which just really was like an aha moment for me. Like we're educators, and so what are forms of learning, or how can we make our learning more impactful? Um, and they talked about choice, like, which as educators we know is huge. Making connections, like, again, as an educator, like, I think what's the most empowering thing I have available to me is my relationships with my kids and my colleagues and their families and the community. And then how do we again start to communicate? So like it's really like the plan itself is really feels very simple. It simplifies a very complex, like this is such a complex thing. And it requires us to listen and understand like where we are in this learning process. And I think that's even been taken away because so many of the messages that educators get are not to listen and understand and aren't respecting this grieving process, this new identity learning process. But so many of the messages that teachers are getting is, well, if you practice a little more self care or found a little, like, again, that onus of responsibility for us to fix this is coming across, but I think in a way that continues to be harmful instead of helpful. And so that like this sort of idea started me thinking like, where can I find the joy in my day while also honoring that I'm going through this grieving, this relearning process of trying to determine who I am and where is my place in this field of education. Like I could, like you said, I could do both of those in tandem.
Right, and as you're talking and thinking about, when so many of the time, so often I think definitions are where you sort of we fall down, right, in terms of that
Yeah.
really understanding, and that self-care might be spoken. You should practice self-care, and the thought is, right, it's a capitalist, like buy candles, pay for massages, right? Like go shop, like I don't know, like go on vacation. Well, that's like all those things require money and time and choice, and they don't necessarily provide that connection, right? That allows us to communicate, make a plan, and then act. It keeps us sort of in those individual silos, right? And it makes it an individual problem instead
Yeah.
of that collaborative.
Yes, that and then you still come back to this harmful environment, like, that's not solving the problem, that's putting a Band-Aid on a symptom and not getting at the root of the problem, so, yeah.
So, as you know, because you and I'm going to share the gift you gave me a couple of weeks ago, as the third reader of my dissertation, which was called Pages of Potential, and it was an action research study on picture books as tools for adult senses of identity and belonging. And I bring this up one because I think it's probably the first time I'm actually really talking about this other than in the dissertation process. And I'm so grateful for your piece and a conversation that allowed that to happen. But that picture books, right, were I found in the research that picture books can actually help with some of this connection and choice and communication, um, and that we are as adults are not finding these existing spaces to explore picture books as adult readers, which is what we just did a little bit with both Why Do We Cry and Grief is an Elephant.
Yeah,
And as one of my participants said, that they said that they really enjoyed talking about picture books, the connections to the book, and not having to put the lens of being a teacher on and thinking about how kids are going to respond and focusing on ourselves. And in this action research, adults coming together to talk about picture books created this space where we did have some communication and conversation that increased our senses of belonging and connection. And so we're in these schools, right, with picture books are hopefully plentiful depending on where we
Right,
are
right, right.
teaching. And as book bans, etc., and book challenges, right, shift perhaps the books that we have access to. um, we have these tools right in our classrooms that can help us connect with our students, but also with each other as adults.
Yeah, I will say, like, I was so honored to be a third reader and part of your dissertation or your doctoral journey. Um, for years now, I started, I know, I think with Donalyn Miller had, book a day. And then I'm trying to remember, I think it was Julian Hayes. I hope I'm saying that correct, who came out with classroom book a day. And that became my non-negotiable. Like every single day, I read at least one picture book. And that's my one 10 minutes or so, sometimes longer, sometimes less. It depends on the day and how we're feeling in the class and everything else. That I close the door and the kids kind of come down to the carpet and we read a picture book. And sometimes it's just for pure joy. Sometimes it's to address something that's happening in our room because it gives us, as Rudine Sims Bishop says, those mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors like into each other's lives. And it it has been, like, profoundly life-changing for me. So, to even, like, read some of your dissertation work and your research and say, "Why are we not using this beautiful, joyful medium with adults?" Not like you said, not to look at it from just, like, "What's this gonna mean for my kids in my classroom?" But, "What does this mean for me as a human being?" And so one of the first ways is we start to talk about like what are ways that we can find the joy while we're processing this grief is picture books. It's number one on my list is picture books. That's the joy in my day.
I mean, it literally was so much so for me that as I changed my context, my professional contexts over the last couple of years, I have been both a in-person classroom teacher, recently a remote classroom teacher for 2 years plus the emergency. Um,
Uh-huh.
I worked, with adults, and now I'm working with adult learners. Right. I had to find something that where my joy was amidst all of this grief. And I was told by my chair, Dr. Wendy Crocker, it said, whatever your dissertation's on, it's got to be something that you want to dig into and live with. And I was like, oh, right now in education, that would be picture books. So,
Yeah.
that's where we were. That's where I was. And thinking about what else might help. Are there other things that have helped you, Cindy, as you think about
I
managing
will
grief?
say, I think one of the other things, like, and again, this is sort of a connection to picture books that really helps me um really like get much more depth and more joy from each book is a lot of times when I take the time and sort of Google and look for sometimes interviews with the authors or go to the authors' websites, like hearing their creative process and the subtle, unique messages that I don't always register right away in the books, like, and then going back to them, really has a huge impact on me. Like, so I would highly recommend, not just sitting with the picture book, but trying to find out a little bit more about the author and their process, in terms of bringing that connection and that choice and that joy, like bringing those all together, that's really had a huge impact on me to hear so many of these authors speak about their process for writing.
I I wholeheartedly agree. And and it's this picture. I had originally chosen this picture. This was
Yeah.
as COVID began and as I was dealing with the grief and overwhelm as I was teaching, I would turn, and this was the jigsaw puzzle that was right next to my remote classroom teaching. Yes, because for
Mm.
me, it's digging into things and looking really closely at small things helps me with big things. And so whether that's, looking at photographs, whether it's looking at jigsaw puzzles, whether it's looking at how the author's identity fits in with the topic of the book, the way my identity reads the book, the way the conversations we can have, like that idea of looking closely, I find really helpful, and particularly, as you said, with the creators of picture books.
Yeah, I
Um,
love your puzzle.
there was one piece that was missing that was never found, but otherwise all of those pieces did fit there.
Did they find their way into the big
They
picture?
they did find their way into the big picture. Um, yeah, and so, that brings us to this slide right here, and I'm moving our faces around because of where they need to fit for the viewers to be able to see them, so,
Okay.
um, yeah. So, we were talking about how we can use grief,
Yeah.
and that idea, right, of what self-care is, and that power for change.
And I will see for me, like when we were talking about what do we do, for me, um, again, I go back to this idea, and it was such an aha moment of like really grief is a learning process and learning to like revise who our identity. Um, for me, especially when COVID started, I know a lot of my friends talked about how they really struggled to read during COVID. For me, it had the opposite impact. Like I found myself reading voraciously. Um, but a lot of the books that I read were books about people from other people's perspectives. Like I feel like reading widely about other people who didn't look like me, who didn't have the same experiences as me, um, really also had a huge impact on sort of inspiring me and helping me reform my identity and find some confidence and some joy and some connection. Um, in who I was and a sense of humanity. So for me, reading widely about all different kinds of things, from different professional books to other books that help me um, really dig in and try to understand other people's perspectives better and other people's possible grieving processes, which look different than mine. Like that really helped me a lot start to reform a new identity and who I was and what I wanted to communicate and accomplish and connect with.
That's powerful. That transformational change that reading
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
gave
Yeah.
you. One of the books that I read in that process, and I would say that my reading of what one might consider adult, right, thick novels and
Uh-huh.
nonfiction, that shifted. There were some pieces, like How the Word is Passed, Clint Smith's, and some other books that grabbed me, but mostly I had to go to reading things in smaller sections, and
Mhm.
or it had to serve a purpose. And one of the books that worked, that I sort of drew on and have been drawing on is Adrienne Maree Brown's Emergent Strategy. And this idea that, again, looking closely, that we can ask why rather than judging those judging differences as better, or as odd, or in whatever way we might judge them, that when we just ask why, that humanizes things and we learn from them, and then thinking about how in sort of in real time can I act to find more humanity, right? That curiosity
Mhm.
piece. So that's one of the books that I leaned into. And I know that as I move forward, there's another book that we both have leaned
Yes,
into.
that we both leaned into. Goldie Muhammad's work, her first book was Cultivating Genius, and it had to say that it didn't have a profound impact on me would be an understatement. It really, really, truly did. Because I think, um, and she talks about in the book the history of the Black literacy societies and how Education right now, I think we're so siloed. Like you had mentioned earlier, like that that feeling of aloneness and loneliness and not communicating. Like I think we hold that in because we're grieving instead of reaching out, and I think that reaching out would help us heal better. Like I think we'd find we're not so alone. Um but she talks about a lot about how we teach in very siloed ways focused on skills and standards. And we leave out sort of this identity building, which is so important for ourselves, for our students, that intellect, our knowledge, how we share that, and the criticality, like how do we take action with that? But especially, and this is her definition of joy, but especially like unearthing joy, finding joy in our day. And this just really, really, really spoke to me. It came out shortly after COVID started. And I remember like my colleagues tease me because that's my phrase, like, where's the joy in your day? Find the genius and the joy in your day. Like they tease me because that's sort of my mantra. Like where are those pieces, no matter how hard it gets, where we can be human, where we can find beauty. And I even think about Ellen Keene's work with engaging children in the classroom. And she talks about like the ultimate in engagement, one of those pieces is finding beauty. Like that's what that curiosity that we have to find beauty is what puts us in that sense of like Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory, like where we just get so engrossed in what we're doing, and that's where we find the joy in our day. And so like this has been sort of like her work has been my North Star. Really truly has been.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about one of the ways, we talk so much in education about assessment, and there's so many painful and excruciating ways that we try to figure out if what we're doing is working, and excruciating definitions of what working looks like. That's a different conversation. I had to get that in there, and I think we we have an agreement there. But one of the pieces is I remember um, sitting back in my classroom one day as a probably sort of maybe 5 years in, and thinking, oh, who's smiling and laughing and pointing to the book that they're reading? That's all the assessment I need to know if that book is a good fit book, or however we think about five fingers. I never ascribed to that. But that idea of joy, right? And that my goal in during independent reading in particular, but throughout the classroom day, was where am I seeing pointing and laughing and smiling? And if that's happening, then we're on the right track. So
And
as
even like I saw Goldie present um at Anderson's Bookshop, which is an independent bookstore by my house that has some wonderful authors that I get the opportunity to see. But I had never really thought about it. I thought about it with Alan Keene's work and engaging, and I had started collecting data around engagement. And I think really my personal belief is the only way you can do that is to ask kids, because otherwise when you come in and observe, it's too easy to misinterpret compliance and participation. Engagement, true engagement's internal, and the only way we can know what's going on inside our kids is to ask kids. But Goldie also talked about taking data on joy. Like why isn't joy and engagement data front and center as part of our teacher evaluation, administrator evaluation, like right next to those standardized tasks? Because if we're not fully engaged in a joyful way, then how like that's what school is about. That's how we know we're getting to the things that matter, that are sustainable, and that can transfer into our communities long after we're done with school. Although as a lifelong learner, I don't think I'm ever done with school. But how do we collect that data? Like that was I've been really pondering that question since I saw her about a month ago.
it's a powerful question, and it's the social and emotional. literacy that we as adults need to learn. We talk a lot about SEL, right? Social emotional learning. And
Mhm.
it is important that we have mental health and that we understand how to affirm people. But that piece that you just said that, that Goldie shares in everything, actually in everything that she does,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
right, is that that's a piece that that we adults can learn, right? That what is it, right? What's the essence of what matters? And a couple of the questions that there are all kinds there's all kinds of advice, right, in this book, and it integrates music and art and coloring, and there's a
Love
soundtrack,
that.
like, right, like all the things. And Dr. Mohammed asks us to think about some of these questions, and I just pulled three of the many questions as
Mhm.
we think about how we can move forward, right, holding that grief. And maybe I'd like to ask you, Cindy, like, what gives you joy for this profession?
Um, boy, that's probably watching my students and their families um feel joy and feel heard and seen and valued. Like I played around with passion projects the first trimester. Um and they sort of have gotten pushed out by too many tests that we're giving our kids. Um, but wow, like, wow, the joy that they felt because they had a choice, because it was something they connected with, because they felt like they had something important to communicate. Almost every parent in my classroom came that day. Like we had a big celebration of learning where the kids shared what they had been working on. And all of the parents were there. And it just, boy, that day like filled me up so, so, so much to see the kids and their families feel like they were seen and heard and valued. That was huge. What brings you joy?
Oh. It's, as you were talking, I think it's a word that we sometimes overuse, but community, right? Like it's
Yeah.
what you just described as true community. Um,
Yes.
and I would say it's the same thing. One of the things I'm doing now is I'm teaching adults who are developing their competencies in English, and um, they have been in the United States for various lengths of time and arrived here in many different ways, and speak many languages. But one of the things that we are talking a lot about is how we feel, and to hear when we talk about what of the I find it's difficult to look at curriculum that's been designed for adult learners
Mm.
of English that fits who these learners are. And so one of the things, it's pretty stereotypical in some ways. And one of the pieces is it talks a lot about, are you outgoing or are you shy? And I talk about how when people aren't always one way or the other, right? And we all kind of talk about that in our languages. And we center English, but we trans language throughout the class because that's right. Those are the languages that we bring. But the piece around um, in this space, I am outgoing, but in this space, I am not. And then hearing students say, when I'm here and in this room, I'm coming because I connect with you. And they mean you in the collective of the students in the class. And so for me, when I am able to be in a space where people are finding connection, I feel joy in that authentic connection with these students who happen to be adults in this case. But being able to be in a profession where I have the wide range, and in this particular position, I have freedom of choice as an educator, right? I have that autonomy to be able to choose which picture books I read with adults, to modify, because the standardized tests are not something that I am teaching into or towards. I am able to build language through community. And so that is bringing me great joy. And it's a huge privilege to be able to exercise that choice in this part of my career as well. So, community, right? Being in community is what it
And
is.
You know what I was even thinking about hearing you say this? Like we've been thinking about how can we share what brings us joy to help other people find joy in their day. And it's so different all over this country. So I started wondering as you were talking, like for people who live in an area where there are more banned books, where they're not maybe able to grab the picture books that they would normally have chosen. Like, don't forget that literacy exists on so many levels. So, one of the first forms of sharing stories was oral storytelling. And so I would say, like, are there ways that you can capture oral storytelling? It's not a book in print, but it certainly is a way that we can share ourselves. Would that be a way that some classroom teachers might safely be able to share the gift of story and give students choice, like being able to have them choose their story and communicate who they are as people and have a class share that as a community of learners. Like I think in schools we underappreciate all the different ways that we have available to us to share story. And oral storytelling is certainly one. Images are one. There's all kinds of multimodal text that we have access to. So is oral storytelling perhaps another way when we don't have access to the picture books because of book banning? That would move that conversation forward.
And art, as you said, right? Murals.
Yeah.
There's so many different ways and mediums that we and that humans, right, find ways to do that connection. And I think that for me, I'm always thinking about that it's also right, it's your choice. And so and I that piece of making sure that there's space for telling stories, but also not requiring students, right, to tell their
Right,
stories,
right,
but
right, right.
it's where they feel able to, right, is because I've seen the other happen. And so I
Yes,
always
yes.
give air to that as well because
Mhm.
I've seen the other, and so nobody owes us their stories, but we want to create spaces to be able to connect and choose to tell them. And I think what you just shared is sort of what we're doing here today, right? We're finding a way to have
Yeah.
some joy
Yeah.
and connection.
Yeah. And how do we communicate with people who aren't in education, because I feel like so many of the headlines have been driven by people who aren't in education and have a false understanding of what it means to be a teacher today. So even just starting there, like being able to communicate what it means to be in a classroom today, to help shift that thinking. And it's just sometimes it's as simple as one person at a time, and that like, but if we all do that collectively, right? I think of like the pandemic. Like if I do that with one or two people and they spread that in, like soon maybe that will start to help shift the conversation. Like has something as simple as just, articulating with people who aren't in education, how do we start to spread that message?
Yeah, and I think that, that some of the conversations are hard to start.
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about global issues, right? Like, and I'm thinking particularly when I say that around what's happening in the West Bank and Gaza, right? And in Israel and how we talk about different
Hmm.
um, people have strong feelings on many sides of issues that bring in religion, which is fundamental, right? Which bring in politics. And so
Right.
picture books are a way into those conversations as well. And creating space for the conversation is the first part. And because if we don't talk about it, we just hold it all inside and that doesn't work for us.
Right. Right. I totally agree.
Um,
Right.
and I know that we're moving towards the end of our conversation. Did you want to read a little bit of the end of Why Do We Cry?
Sure. So I will actually start in the beginning and then hop to the end. So
One-
why do we cry? Mario had been quiet all morning, and his mother sat patiently beside him. Finally, in a small, near whisper voice, the little boy asked, Mom, why do we cry? I love some of the images in this story. She thought about it for a moment and then answered, We cry for a lot of reasons, Mario. Sometimes we cry because the sadness we feel is so great that we just can't contain it. And she goes on to talk about all the other reasons we cry for sadness, for other purposes. And then toward the end of the book, Mario hugged his mother tightly and kissed her on the nose like he did when he was a baby. Thanks, Mom. I feel much better, but why are you crying? Because, my love, we can also cry when we're happy. And then it goes into the different back matter pages that you showed earlier.
I think of my children. Oh, like, and I can hear my children saying, like, "Are you okay?" And I can hear my older child saying, "Oh, those are just her happy tears. They just fall out all the time." And I'm like, they do, right? They do.
You
So,
go forward, consider leaning into a good cry. And then I would say once you've had a good cry, consider one or two things that you can do to have choice again, to connect and to communicate with others. Even the tiniest little thing has the power to start to spread so we can collectively find joy again.
and I hope that you, Cindy, as your year continues and wraps up, find joy, continue to find joy in your students and in your family and in your community. And as someone who is not currently in a classroom with young children, I am glad to know that you, clearly someone who loves children, is there with both your grief and your joy.
Thank you. And then we have on our screen if you need to touch base with either of us um, to continue the conversation. We're here for you to connect with and communicate with in any way that might be helpful for anybody watching to help find, process their grief and find their joy.
And I noticed that I have a typo because I put my website as a Gmail address because, making mistakes is also part of what we do, and there is grief and sometimes joy in those too. So it is actually sarahcbnorsworthy, .com. So that is a website hybrid email that does not make sense. So I can be reached through my sort of named website. The at Gmail shouldn't be there. So
There you go.
Cindy, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.